We are finally seeing the first few pieces of evidence emerge showing that a recession in the US is on its way. Deutsche Bank specifically came out with a new projection, one that looks at over 200 years of data and concluded that there is a 100% probability we will experience a severe slowdown in the near future. This is a model that has successfully predicted the last 6 recessions in a row, going back to the 1970s, and the pessimism isn't just a headline draw. Big-time analysts are now openly suggesting that bad times are almost certainly ahead. But most Americans are not reacting to the news. For the last 3 years, the tale has been the same. The story begins in January 2021. Following an unprecedented rise, the stock market began its fall from all-time highs. Many at this point here were calling for the beginning of the end. This was going to be the start of a massacre in the markets, the opening act in a massive recession that would span years. But following a 25% decline, the markets sort of evened out. The economy continued to remain healthy in the sense that jobs were plentiful. The unemployment rate dropped to near record lows, following a massive historic shock in 2020. Everyone you know had a job, prices were rapidly rising, checks were being handed out, and most importantly, the housing market was on fire, with prices jumping in a way we had never seen before. What started as a call for a recession ended with 3 years of absurd growth. The American audience was sick of hearing the word recession. Week after week, the supposed slowdown that was coming never came, and recession fatigue became a new phenomenon. Instead of a slowdown, it was rising prices, record corporate profits, and unsustainable interest rates. Today we're left with a supposedly good economy, one with near record-breaking employment, but everywhere else the suffering continues. To buy a home today, one needs to spend an average of $2,573 per month, a sum that's nearly 2 times larger than what the average person would spend in 2020. What was once known as the American dream slowly transformed into the American nightmare, and today many are left wondering where all of this goes. When will the relief in the housing market begin, and is it true that a crash is coming to end this massive super bubble that has been raging since 2012? Well, in my opinion, to answer these questions, we have to begin with a bit of history. Going to February of 2012, the housing market in the United States was at a point where it reached a bottom following what was the worst real estate crash since the Great Depression. With interest rates nearing all-time lows and unemployment nearing all-time highs, the market began its slow recovery back. This period was interesting for a couple of reasons. Through the lens of the seasonally adjusted Case-Shiller, the market wouldn't recover to the peak 06 price until December of 2016. This shows that once the market began to turn, it wouldn't make a comeback for over 10 years, spending 5 of those years with prices free-falling. Most people like to remember the 2008 crash as something that happened overnight on Wall Street, but it was a very slow-moving train wreck that took years to play out. Now, a lot of you might be saying that I'm wasting my time even explaining the timeline of this last crash because the environment back then was so much different. In that crash, the downward spiral was supposedly fueled by bankruptcies, unemployment, and surging inventory levels, and today we have record low bankruptcies, record low unemployment, and near record low inventory. Therefore, such a crash is not possible. Now, before I reveal why, please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button if you're enjoying the content thus far. Every like that I receive is seen as fuel to boost views via the algorithm. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could just take 1 second and hit that button and help me out. Now back to what I was saying. The skeptics are right in the sense that today's environment looks nothing like 2008, but let's take a moment to see why they're wrong about the overall thesis. From a logical perspective, the entire concept of a bubble is based on prices. And prices are an illusion when looked at through the prism of time. What I mean by that is $100 in 1980 went a lot further than $100 in 2023, so judging prices without adjusting for inflation is a pointless exercise that does us no good. To get around that, we can take a look at home prices adjusted for inflation, and what we see is that for a very long time, home prices in the United States remained pretty much flat until the early 2000s. Here we saw prices enter unknown territory, reaching a CPI-Shiller ratio of 0.92. At this point here, the bubble collapsed in what was known as the '08 crash. Prices dropped all the way back near the long-term average of 0.6. This level is commonly accepted as healthy using over 100 years of data. Now, following the depths of the last recession, we once again saw another bubble developing. Prices have actually already eclipsed the previous peak of 0.91, which occurred back in March of 2021. Earlier this year, they reached an all-time high of 1.04. Now, without taking into consideration anything else, most would agree that this is yet another bubble, and a collapse back to that 0.6 territory is only a matter of time. To deny this is to deny 100 years of data. To say that there is no bubble is to say that we have entered a new paradigm where home prices will simply be more expensive for decades to come, and this era of somewhat quote-unquote low prices is simply over. But as we know, all things tend to regress to the mean, and I see this as no exception. Answering how and when it will collapse is the difficult part, but this graph clearly shows that the future doesn't look bright for the real estate market. The corrective force of regression is likely to start impacting the markets very soon. Like every other market on earth, boom and busts are just another part of the story, and the last 12 years have clearly shown that based on historical numbers, this is one of the biggest boom eras in modern economic history. A move towards the long-term average gets more and more likely the higher and higher this number goes, and based on the tip that we saw in the summer of 2022, it's very likely that we have already seen a peak in inflation-adjusted prices in this cycle. Now the question is simple: how far do we go, and when does the real spiral begin? While accurately predicting a real estate crash is extremely challenging, there are key indicators that can provide us with insights into short-term price trends. One important factor to consider is the supply of homes on the market, as an increase in active listings often precedes price declines. However, it's important to note that the current market conditions with historically low mortgage rates have discouraged many homeowners from selling. This reluctance to sell is understandable given the favorable conditions. In today's economy, it's highly unlikely that rational individuals would choose to sell their homes. As a result, the inventory levels in the market are significantly lower than what was previously considered normal, almost half of what is typically expected. Now, with the job market tight, bankruptcies at near all-time lows, and no apparent builder boom to add to the supply, the question is how? How can the market prices crash when supply simply cannot go up? Well, just like the last crash, this next one will also start with speculators, also known as the investors. Today, almost 1 out of every 10 homes sold goes to an investor, and that number may be even higher if we add in the mom and pop investors that are often excluded from these numbers. Investors operate under very different psychology compared to the typical buyer. They are much more likely to dump inventory and get out once things get bad, and they have a much higher incentive to do so before the decline accelerates. Today we see that while investing has slowed down since last summer, investors never began panic selling. They held on to their inventory, betting that the market would remain resilient, and thus far, they've been right. While some markets experience small dips, many East Coast markets remain very strong, allowing investors to remain active. Now, where am I going with this? Well, going back to the start of the video, once the economy begins to turn, which is by the way something we have not experienced since 2009, the entire landscape will see massive changes. Lending will tighten, prices will begin to dip, unemployment will jump, and demand will further dampen. This panic will eventually cause investors to flee, and once that happens, the self-feeding deflationary loop that caused a 27% decline in prices last time will once again begin. Fueled by low interest, a healthy economy, and extra stimuli provided during 2020, this strong rise is already broken. Now, in the face of a Federal Reserve that refuses to budge from its agenda of lowering inflation, it will be extremely difficult for prices to continue this climb. Interest rates essentially dictate the future of the market, and for the past year, they have wrestled with rising prices to the point that the damage is already apparent. While your local market may still be overheating, many boom towns like Austin have already experienced significant damage. Austin has seen a median sale price decline of 15%, which on paper doesn't seem too bad, but that actually represents an $85,000 decline in typical value. Another example is San Francisco, which percentage-wise has seen home values decline 13.4%. Due to the nature of California's expensive prices, this translates to a $220,000 decline. That's a pretty serious downturn, but looking across the nation, this impact is not yet widespread. In plenty of markets, prices are still close to all-time highs, and with the spring selling season at its peak, it's hard to gauge the market as seasonality has taken over. In previous years, list prices have typically peaked around the last week of May and continue to stay strong throughout June. It's only once July approaches that we see a downturn in competition and list prices, and the full extent of the damage is felt. So while it may seem like a recovery is taking place, that's not necessarily true. With further interest rate hikes and a diminishing economy going into Q3 of this year, there's still a very strong possibility that we're going to see a second half dip in prices just like what happened in 2022, except this time the plunge will be even worse. Thank you guys for watching. As always, please make sure you hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed it, and let me know what you think about your local market in the comments below.